So let's talk about a couple of diseases first before we get into reproductive diseases. So I want to talk a little bit about blackleg, Clostridial diseases. Most people vaccinate for Clostridial disease, but a lot of people think, well, if I use a quote unquote 7-way or an 8-way or a 5-way or whatever, that's going to give me pretty much protection to everything. I mean, numerous times in practice, we'd be in a wreck with some disease and we'd be talking about the vaccination program and the guy would be very frustrated. Well, it can't be an issue with that because I vaccinate for everything. Well, what do you use? A 7-way. Well, understand the other thing is, what does a 7-way mean? It means exactly nothing. You need to know what the products are in that vaccine. An 8-way vaccine, and we throw that around like we know what we're talking about. Describe an 8-way vaccine. That could include tetanus. It could include Clostridium hemolyticum. Those are very important to know the difference in those. So don't get hung up with 7-way, 6-way, a 4-way viral. What does that mean? Well, it might mean something to you, but as you're trying to translate that to something else, or you're trying to, so kind of understand not just that this is a so many way vaccine, but what pathogens does this vaccine supposedly help control? And again, what are your risks? And we're talking about Clostridial vaccines. Tetanus is a Clostridial. So does every cattle are not as susceptible to tetanus as horses, people, a small ruminant, stuff like that. They're much more susceptible than cattle. Can cattle get tetanus? Certainly. And when do they get it? It's usually when there's a lot of stress in practice. The most where we saw a lot of problems with tetanus was in heifers. And people are calving heifers, a lot of dystocia, a lot of problems. What happens? They get in there, they have lacerations in the reproductive tract, and then Clostridial organisms like to grow in the absence of oxygen, so they're going to try to get down in the tissue. That's the reason, when you're a kid and you stuck a nail in your foot, well, you're going to get lockjaw if you don't go get your tetanus shot, you see, because these organisms like to grow in puncture wounds, places where there's not a lot of oxygen. So, red water. Red water is Clostridium hemolyticum. Usually we associate that with liver flukes, okay, because the liver fluke migrates through the liver, causes some damage, and then Clostridium comes in, sets up, and can kill the animal. Okay, so what do we have to, what's the factors we have to have for liver flukes? Okay, so we need soil. Usually it's a more alkaline soil. We have to take that where the particular snail that's part of the pathway of this, it only lives in, and basically all these things kind of have to come together. So a lot of people say, well, there's no risk of liver flukes here. Well, yeah, if you have the right soil, you have the moisture, the other things to go with it. And again, I practiced in dry West Texas, and I actually had one operation. We had a lot of issues with liver flukes. They had a lot of irrigation, and then they had the soil that had the proper pH, all the other issues that kind of fit into it. I go to South Texas, I get down around the Gulf Coast. There's areas that there's a lot of flukes, there's areas they're not. So again, that's kind of local to you. If you've got a risk of flukes, then you need to make sure that you include hemolyticum in your product. If there's not a risk, then there's probably no need to include it. Where do Clostridium live? Where do they come from? What's the risk of passing from animal to animal? Is Clostridium Blackleg? And let's use the term blackleg because that's where most people are going to think. That's one of the organisms one of the Clostridial organisms, probably the one we're most that's talked about most, right? So blackleg, where does that organism live? It lives in the soil, right? And then the other place it actually lives in the intestine of the animal. So if you've got animals, you've probably got blackleg. What happens to cause the disease? And again, this is one of the older diseases, and some of the things we still don't totally understand, but that organism has to get out in the muscle to cause the problem, right? It has to get out the muscle. So basically, a lot of times you'll see blackleg kind of blow-ups after a bad storm or something, bruised cattle, you hauled a bunch of cattle, whatever. But if there were bruises, sometimes that's associated with blackleg outbreaks, but not always. Sometimes you just get a blackleg outbreak. So one of the problems you'll see is, again, we say these are in the soil. You'll see it where you have a lot of poorly drained fields sometimes. I'll see that sometimes cattle on wheat pasture. That one field, maybe one pasture, we'd see a lot of Clostridium in. Usually those are fields that don't drain well. okay? And then the other one is dust. Okay, so again, that organism lives in the soil. When is another time we see a lot of blackleg? When it gets real drouthy. And so what happens? We bring those cattle in to feed them. We got them in smaller areas. They're kicking up a lot of dust. They're stressed. They're bruising around. So those are probably the two biggest risks. Okay, so what else can you do to control it? Again, this is a disease that vaccination is about the only control. Understand your other risk, but again, if you've got perfect weather, that still doesn't say you can't get blackleg. So again, with blackleg, I think it's just important to understand that disease is kind of everywhere, has a potential to be everywhere. Vaccinate for it. The vaccine's pretty effective. Make sure you follow the directions. Now that's one vaccine if you give to a bunch of baby calves while they still have immunity from mother's milk. Then that vaccine might not process like it should, so then about the time you wean them, you might not have the immunity you need. So read the bottle. If it says give a vaccination at 3 months and then a booster, then follow those directions. Because again, if you give a bunch of wet navel calves a blackleg shot, and then they get really stressed around weaning, they can still and will get blackleg. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about BVD, bovine viral diarrhea. Okay, this is kind of a virus that is in the same class as the hog cholera virus. And you know, now hog cholera is considered a foreign animal disease in the United States, but not too many years ago it was pretty prevalent. There's a lot of veterinarians used to make their living vaccinating hogs for hog cholera. What do you see with hog cholera? You can see a lot of swine dying, but usually, again, once it settles in, there's reproductive loss, okay? So the thing about BVD that we've got to understand is this virus is constantly, and the term we use is a quasi-species, but it's constantly changing in that. In other words, you can have one calf, you can have an animal that infected with BVD, and those organisms, and I'll use the term loosely, it's kind of like they're continually mutating. You're getting all kinds of populations coming out of that one population. So you started out, and again, this is a little ridiculous, but the term I always used is okay, like if I have a bunch of yellow-headed wasps, right? And so I start out and I have all these yellow wasps in there, right? And then every once in a while, if enough of these yellow wasps breed, we're going to have a red wasp, right? And again, I know nothing about genetics of wasps, but this just kind of makes sense to me. So pretty soon we have a little population of red wasp, and then pretty soon we have a little population of green wasp, right? But our main population is still the yellow. Then what happens if something comes in and whams on those yellow wasps? One of the other population takes off. So that's the concept of quasi-species. And again, I think we talked a little bit about this being a quasi-species, kind of understanding the concept of the quasi-species, and that's important that we understand this virus is continually changing. Okay, so we're going to talk about some stuff, and this is going to sound, he's getting off kind of complicated, or not really complicated, but why do we care? There's two biotypes of BVD, cytopathic and non-cytopathic. And again, I want you to remember non-cytopathic, because that's going to be important as we go on through this. Non-cytopathic is responsible for persistent infection, okay? And so then there's subgenotypes. There's 12 globally, but in the United States we basically deal with 3, and that's subtype 1A, subtype B, and subtype 2. Now again, you can, subtype 2, if you remember back in the 90s, that was the one that hit Canada real bad, came down into this country. We had a lot of dead cattle, and these cattle would bleed out of their nose, bleed out of their mouth. So there was the perception that subtype 2 is the bad one and the others aren't as bad. Well, there can be a lot of difference in virulence, even in 1As or 1Bs or 2s. So to say a 2s are worse than 1As or Bs, no, that they're just different subtypes. And so I think we need to make sure we understand that. Okay, there is cross immunity sometimes. In other words, sometimes there's cross reaction, sometimes there's not. So again, when we're trying to diagnose BVD, we need to understand that there's basically 3 types that we deal with in the United States, 1A, 1B, and 2. Currently, 1B is considered the most common BVD virus that's out there, okay? So this is a picture of a calf with mucosal disease. Now again, mucosal disease is BVD. It has to be a persistently infected animal, and then it gets cross-infected with another virus. We're not going to spend a lot of time up talking about mucosal disease. It's not as common as it used to be, but this is kind of what BVD would, calves with respiratory disease, a lot of times it's kind of what they look like. So I threw that slide in. But again, remember the iceberg a while ago. So this would be like on top of the iceberg. You got a lot more impact underneath the water.